What is distro hopping, and how do I avoid it? For those of you starting your journey to Linux, it may be difficult to settle in on one particular distro, such as Ubuntu, Linux Mint, or another Linux distro. This is what we call distro hopping, where you are unable to fully settle in on a distro, and when switching to Linux, this will make the transition more difficult, as you don't know what suits your needs best. Before you even think about settling in on a Linux distro, you should consider some things, such as, what do I use my PC for, and what particular desktop environment am I most comfortable with. Starting off with the first tip, try out a Linux environment under a virtualized environment, or test it out as a live system. If you want to try out Linux before you decide to use it permanently, I suggest you download a program like VirtualBox, and install a guest Linux operating system inside a virtual machine, or VM. This will give you a taste of the particular distro you are trying out, and this way, you will get to know whether you like it or not. For a slightly more pleasant experience, running the distro on a USB is just as easy to do, although you will need a USB stick, with a minimum of 8 GB, and you will want to use a name brand, like SanDisk. Tip number 2, if you have a reason to go to Linux, do it. If not, stay on your current OS. I am saying this, because some people who want to go to Linux, or have switched to it, can find it somewhat daunting that Windows or Mac software will not work natively on it, so they must use something like Wine, or Crossover, to get around this, and this itself is not a solution, because latency, and other issues arise, especially when trying to use something that needs direct access to hardware, and some Windows programs don't function properly with Wine, so if you want to switch to Linux, you'll need to somehow compensate by using free and open source software, lots of which I find to be awesome, and very useful. In fact, the majority of stuff I use is free and open source, and if you're a similar person, in the sense that you mostly use free stuff, migrating to Linux would theoretically not be all that difficult, but once again, you need to find something that you really like, and stick with it for as long as you want. Tip number 3, be prepared to learn new things. With change comes learning, and Linux is no different in this regard, as the user must learn how to navigate the OS, and use it to a basic extent. Otherwise, Linux is pretty much useless, unless you know how to work with it, install software, etc. Tip number 4, make sure you can install it safely without deleting all user files and data. If you want to move to Linux, it's important to consider how you will do so, as this will greatly affect the transition process. If you decide to put it on a hard drive or SSD, you should use a separate one to the main one in your PC, if possible, or at least install Linux alongside the main OS, although this is quite problematic, so I advise you buy a second hard drive, and install Linux to that one instead, and this way, you avoid all conflict between Linux and Windows. However, corruption remains a possibility, so make sure you back up all important data, in case something happens on either hard drive. And lastly, tip number 5, try out all the software available on Linux. With the ever-growing application support for Linux, it is becoming a more viable OS for us desktop users who can get by with free and open source stuff. However, for Windows or Mac users, you will struggle if you rely on Windows or Mac specific software, so unless you use free and open source programs all the time, I don't recommend you look into using Linux, but of course, try it out if it is of interest. This being said, the majority of free and open source applications can do the same stuff as popular paid-for software. For example, OpenOffice has gotten really good with reading all the Office file types, and it has pretty much all the same functionality as Microsoft Office. Even if you lose out on a few professional features, most of the stuff you'll need will be in OpenOffice, and this is just one example of many great free and open source programs I can recommend to users on Linux, and for people wanting free and open source software in general. Alrighty, That's it for this video, folks. Do remember to like, share, and subscribe, and do enable notifications, so you don't miss out on any future videos. Bye for now.